Everyone could find a seat. Remember, there are actually things that fold down, and we're in an auditorium, and this is the first time I've been in this room speaking in over almost 2 years. So it's an incredible treat. So I think we're almost all ready. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And good evening and buenos noches. Welcome to your National Museum of American History. I'm Anthea Hartig, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Elizabeth Macmillan Director here at the nation's flagship History Museum. And it's a true and humbling honor to be with all of you today. As we come together in community, and after all we've faced, let us acknowledge the precedents of the Piscataway, Pamunkey, and Acostine tribes and their descendants. As we know, the Chesapeake Bay area is rich with indigeneity and is still home to many indigenous peoples from all over the hemisphere. We give our respect and our gratitude to all of them for the opportunity to work and to live in their territories. Can everyone see me, hear me? I know it's like, yeah, you're the tall lady with the white hair. Hard to miss. Everyone can hear me? Great. Please make yourself home here. It is your home during the time of the program this evening and any other time you want to come visit. Do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable, welcome, and received. And I'm particularly grateful to my incredible team, and most of us are wearing name tags, so just let us know if you need anything. We are delighted to welcome this program, especially in light of our work as we together have crafted a new strategic plan that we hope will take us through the next 10 years of our existence. We've dedicated ourselves and my incredible staff and board and volunteers to becoming the most inclusive, relevant, accessible, and sustainable museum in the nation. Our new mystery, it's a mystery. Our new mission is not a mystery, because I've said it so many times, and I try to live it every day, is to empower people to create a more just and a more compassionate future by preserving, sharing, and exploring the complexities of our past. It is grounded in an abiding commitment to presenting complex histories that draw important connections between historical and contemporary events. So thank you all so much for being here. I extend my deep gratitude to the American Association of State and Local History, the National Council on Public History, the Organization of American Historians, for bringing us all together today. Thanks again to everyone who made this possible. And I see many colleagues from across the public history field here and across the museum spaces and across the Academy, and so welcome. It's my pleasure now to introduce John Dicthl, a dear friend and an inspiration, and the president and CEO of the AASLH. John became president in 2015, which I can't tell, is that like dog years? Has that been like, it's 50 years ago. But prior to that, I had the joy of knowing and working with John when he held a similar role at the National Council on Public History for 9 years. And he worked for the Organization of American Historians for 14 years as the deputy director prior to that. To say he's in the family of public history is certainly an understatement. John received both his MA and PhD in early American history from Indiana University and was an adjunct faculty member there in the history department at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. Before graduate school, he worked here for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. He's a graduate of the Seminar for Historical Administration, a program, of course, that stems from AASLH's partnership with the Indiana Historical Society and other important organizations. He helped establish the History Relevance Campaign, the International Federation of Public History, and is very active on the National Coalition for History. Please join me in welcoming John.
Good evening or good afternoon. So I'm John Dicthl, President and CEO of AASLH, and little bit nervous speaking sometimes in front of people, like many of you are, and it would really help me a lot if those of you who are here physically in the audience could do this. Thank you. I need you to do that for about the next 10 minutes. That just makes me more comfortable. And welcome to everyone who's joining us by live stream. Yes, keep it going back there. Yes. So AASLH is a national professional association. We're located in Nashville, Tennessee, and we are dedicated to serving history practitioners at the nation's more than 21,000 history organizations. So that's history museums, historical societies, historic sites, and related organizations. And our mission is to provide leadership and resources to help the field thrive and to make history more meaningful to all people. So, and we do that through a variety of ways, through research, recently through research, advocacy. We have 2 conferences each year now, one in person, one virtual. We publish books. We have lots of committees that are working on projects and reports. But most importantly, we accomplish our mission by bringing historians and public history practitioners of all kinds together, like we've done today. And perhaps in the way that we've brought these 3 national associations together with the museum. So we are here this evening to mark the launch of Reframing History. It's a new set of evidence-backed recommendations for more effectively communicating with public audiences what history is, what historical interpretation involves, and why inclusive history matters to all of us. So what I'm doing up here, my role today, is to kind of describe the project, assuming that not everyone has had a chance to look at the toolkit or read the report. So I'm thrilled to have such an esteemed panel with me today to discuss the challenges and opportunities that stem from this report. And really, this is just the beginning of a conversation, many conversations. So it's a culmination of a lot of conversations and a lot of research, but it's also the beginning of new excitement and new conversations. So the launch of this project has been many years in coming, and I need to thank several people and organizations for being a part of it. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation provided the grant that has funded this project from the beginning. Mellon's support has enabled us not only to conduct the research and publish the report, but to hold events like this one, to share our findings with the field and train historians and museum professionals how to do this. So we are very thankful for the Mellon Foundation's deep commitment to supporting projects that lead to a fuller narrative of American history. And the research for this project was, the most important part of this project, the research, was carried out by the Frameworks Institute, a Washington nonprofit, which is located about a half-mile north of here. And we are especially grateful to our lead researcher, Teresa Miller, who's somewhere in the middle, right there, and Emily LaHote sitting next to her, and the CEO, Nat Kendall-Taylor, and then all the other staff at Frameworks who are involved in this project. And for more than 20 years, Frameworks has studied how people think and talk about numerous social issues, and they have helped mission-driven organizations like AASLH on topics from dental health to climate change to justice reform. They've helped these organizations to communicate in new ways that can spark change. And I should also say, Marcia Semmel is here somewhere. Marcia Semmel, we're sitting right in the very center appropriately, and she is the person who said to me, whenever it was, many decades before the pandemic, you should talk to the Frameworks Institute. So thank you, Marcia. From the beginning, we have partnered on this project with the National Council on Public History and the Organization of American Historians. So I'd like to thank Stephanie Rao, who is not with us today, but Beth English, who is here. I can't see anything. Right in the middle also. Thank you, Beth. And the boards of both organizations for their involvement. Along with an advisory committee jointly appointed by our 3 organizations, our partnership has ensured this project would be useful for the widest possible swath of the history community, from scholars, educators, museum professionals, preservationists, and history advocates of all kinds. Finally, thank you to Anthea and the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. I can think of no better place in the world to begin this conversation. So in 2019, when we began this research effort, online misinformation had already become a massive social problem, both a product and a driver of searing partisan discord. Social injustices inflicted across society and challenges to neo-Confederate symbolism led to the reemergence of history as a focal point of public discourse. That's a great thing. We wanted history to be relevant. That's something that many of us in this room were fighting for, trying to make happen several years ago. Well, now history is relevant. It's in the news every day. Its history is relevant, but almost immediately it's happening in a context. It's become relevant in which is very freighted. So the context in which we were doing this research with frameworks was sort of shifting under our feet. The New York Times published the 1619 Project soon after we started the project. The following summer, amid the global pandemic, the murder of George Floyd sparked a nationwide movement for racial justice and reckoning with our past. And these events placed history at the very center of national conversations. They resulted in urgent, pointed calls for more inclusive, more honest histories of the United States and of communities around the country. In the months that followed, museums, historic sites, educators, and school boards initiated or amplified efforts to help people understand more fully how our society came to be and the work still left to do. Then came the backlash. Legislatures attempted to outlaw use of the 1619 Project in classrooms. The 1776 Commission defined patriotic history as really a purely celebratory, very shallow kind of discussion of the contributions of white elites, a narrow conception of history that became accepted by many as dogma. And now, as we've seen over the past 2 years, legislatures across the country are banning discussions of race, racism, violence, and other topics that might make white students uncomfortable. Attempts to share a story of our past that is more inclusive have been met with ever more fervent efforts to limit who and what counts as part of American history. You know these things already, and I mention them here to make clear that this project, an effort to provide evidence-backed, tested strategies for communicating what history is and why it matters, has grown significantly more urgent since our work began in 2019. Though we did not set out in this direction when we started, the project has ended by providing a playbook for all history communicators to draw on in their efforts to build support for a rigorous and inclusive history. Earlier this week, we shared our findings with the field under the banner of Reframing History. And I'd like to take a minute to describe our report and toolkit in case you haven't looked at it. So it's the result of more than 2 years of deep dive research into how members of the public think about history. Drawing on social science and cognitive psychology research methods, our project has discovered the ways the public thinks about the past, models of understanding, unthinking assumptions, common comparisons that people make, and more. And the report identifies gaps in understanding between these public conceptions of history and the kind of history and the way that history professionals think about history every day. So the project started with mapping the gaps between how the general public thinks about history and how professionals talk about history. And the public, of course, is not a monolith. Our audiences are multifaceted and complex, and each of them bring a range of ideas, backgrounds, and areas of expertise when they engage with our scholarship and institutions. But our research has identified models of understanding shared very widely among the US adult population. These ideas provide foundation for developing and testing strategies for reframing the public conversation around history, shifting it into more productive space. One of our project's central findings is that despite the best efforts of the history community, most members of the public still think history is about finding a singular truth, something historians can do by finding and reporting on just the facts, the simple facts. What our research shows is that much of the public has little frame of reference for what historians actually do, other than scouring the past for facts, and they consider us akin to something like journalists of the past. They tend to be skeptical of any historical interpretation that goes beyond relaying facts and dates, assuming it is a sign someone is injecting subjective opinion and bias into the conversation. This way of thinking directly contributes to the currently polarized climate in which ideological camps argue about who has the most authority over the truth about the past. So when we say interpretation, they hear bias or potential bias. Our field needs to use a more strategic communications approach to make our way out of this endless debate. We have to shift audiences away from this notion of a singular objective truth to build better understanding and have a more productive set of conversations. In short, we need to instead emphasize critical engagement with history. In our report, we lay out 4 recommendations that can effectively achieve this shift in perspective. So first, history communicators, all of you, everyone watching, must talk about critical thinking to shift perceptions of what history involves. Focusing on critical thinking helps people to recognize the value of grappling with different perspectives of the past and helps people see that this rigorous, evidence-based approach is central to the process of doing history. It also helps people understand the tangible, transferable skills that studying history can offer. This can help audiences see history's value in a new light, moving beyond notions that it's just a hobby for enthusiasts. There are, of course, many ways to describe history's value. In our research, emphasizing the use and development of critical thinking skills helps shift public understanding more than when we emphasized how history can reduce prejudice in society, and even when we emphasized how history helps strengthen democracy. Foregrounding critical thinking as the core of history helps people better understand what historical interpretation means. It builds appreciation for its importance to individuals in society, and even generates support for devoting greater resources to our field. This shift was observed empirically in our national survey experiment, and the effect carried over into the qualitative interview and focus group settings. So the second major finding, or the second strategy, is that our field should compare historical interpretation to detective work. So thinking of detective work as the metaphor that we should be adhering to. So to deepen understanding of historical prejudice, we need to really lean into this detective work idea. This metaphor is surely familiar to all of us. Many museums and teachers have probably used the work of detectives to talk about history, but our research shows that it really works for what we want to accomplish. Comparing the historical process to detective work did more to shift public understanding than comparing it to other metaphors such as drawing maps, developing medical knowledge, comparing the work of historians to what a doctor or a medical profession does, processing raw materials, weaving. We tried lots of metaphors, and the detective work one works best. The metaphor builds on existing public comprehension to provide a new model of what historical research and interpretation involves. It helps people more clearly understand the range of sources that historians draw on and the range of methods we use to find and interpret them. Most critically, the detective metaphor helps people to recognize the need for historians to consider multiple perspectives and to update our knowledge as new evidence comes to light, and as new questions animate our research. So the detective metaphor helps us get past that debate over revisionist history. Not only does the detective metaphor move people beyond the idea that doing history is about facts and dates, but our research showed that it could, quote, build support for policies that would promote more inclusive, equity-based engagement with history, such as including more diverse accounts of the past in history textbooks and establishing a government commission to make sense of and reckon with the country's past injustices, unquote. This testing occurred in the past year, simultaneous with the backlash against anti-racist education approaches. Any metaphor that can engender support like that, from that quote I just read, in our current moment is one that I hope all of us will take seriously. So the third recommendation, or third strategy, is that history communicators should emphasize how history helps us make progress toward a more just world. Much of the public knows that history can help society learn from the past mistakes, yet many believe those lessons have already been learned. Others, meanwhile, are somewhat fatalistic about that idea, about the possibility of learning history to improve future outcomes. They are already convinced we are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. In our testing, emphasizing that history can help society to continue to make progress toward justice orients people toward a more inclusive vision of history while boosting recognition that history matters for all of us. What's more, it helps build support for devoting greater resources, including public resources, to engage the public in historical learning and advancement. Progress toward justice could mean, for example, more funding for museums and historic sites, and even allocating more time and resources for exploring the historical underpinnings of an issue that's up for political debate or policy making. So the fourth and final strategy is really bringing together the three previous strategies in a special way. So the fourth strategy is to use specific local solutions-focused examples. So Drawing on local examples, either of historical events or institutions that successfully presented inclusive history, helps people better imagine what a shared inclusive history of the United States looks like. It creates a sense that an inclusive approach is possible. Grounding our conversations about history in specific examples also makes it harder for people to deny the value of confronting historical injustices. Connecting inclusive learning to specific sites and places, specific historical events and communities makes it harder for people to skirt conversations about difficult history by escaping into general worries about bias or revisionism. So in other words, the more specific you are using particular communities or neighborhoods or people, especially when you're talking about the local level, it's hard for people to deny those other communities and people their agency and their identity, and it's hard to deny them a place in the larger narrative. So specificity and concrete examples, local examples are very important. Taken together, these strategies offer critically important tools for all of us in the history field. These approaches have been rigorously tested over the past 2 years and have proven effective at shifting public understanding of what we do, how we do it, and the value of historical work for society. But these recommendations will be most effective if they are adopted across the diverse, dynamic, and multifaceted history community that we represent. From large museums to small town historical societies, from park rangers to teachers to archivists to professors, we must make efforts to speak with a consistent voice. There is so much at stake. As we speak, bills are under consideration around the country that would stealthily limit the study and sharing of our full history. National and local conversations about history are derailed by partisan conflict, and yet polling research continues to show that most people, most Americans, support students learning about diverse perspectives and grappling with difficult issues. They oppose banning books. Most people want members of society to engage with the past. The tools offered by Reframing History can help build on that foundation of support, converting abstract approval into meaningful action. In just over 4 years, the U.S. will commemorate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. From federal agencies to local historical societies, entities all over the country are preparing to use the 250th as an opportunity to share a more complete, more honest vision of our nation's history. The anniversary and the years leading to 2026 will be accompanied by a surge of interest in and funding for historical programs and organizations. Our field must be prepared. 50 years ago, the nation's bicentennial fundamentally transformed professional history practice in the way the public engages with it. The public history movement was really born because of and during the bicentennial. Over the next several years, our field will have an opportunity to once again activate a leap in historical engagement. With a consistent message about what history is and why it matters to society, we can ensure that the establishment of a more inclusive, nuanced, and widely shared narrative of American history is part of the legacy of the semi-quincentennial. The challenges of communicating about history are many, but so too are the opportunities. So thanks to all of you for being here and for being partners in this project. Thank you. So now we'll bring our panelists up. We're going to have this podium magically levitate away. So come on up, take your masks off. And we're going to do questions and answers. Turn it over to Anthea. There are note cards, I believe, somewhere that are being passed around. So if you have questions, feel free to jot those down, and we'll be collecting those. And I will turn this over to the team.
A few mics as well, if you're don't want to scribble or you want to just ask us directly too. Every way we possibly can give you. So, well, hello. It was magically whisked away. Fantastic. Well, Clint, Martha, and Jorge, thank you so much for being with us today. God bless you. I am going to introduce with honor each of our panelists, and then I have a series of questions that we've developed. Some of you graciously sent in questions, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions to arise from the conversation. So thanks in advance for thinking of your good questions. I'm honored that to my right, your left is Clint Smith. Clint, as many of you know, is a staff writer at The Atlantic, and he's the author of the narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, which I think many of you, I know, brought your bigger bag so you could have Clint sign the book that lies within your bag. How the Word is Passed won the 2017 Literary Award. He's also the author of a poetry collection, which I actually do have in my bag, Counting Descent. That won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and was also a finalist for the NAACP Image Award. He's received numerous fellowships, all incredibly worthy, from Andrew Mellon Foundation, and again, thanks to Mellon for their help for bringing us the framework study, New America, the Emerson Collective, Art for Justice Fund, National Science Foundation, and the list goes on. His essays, his poems, and scholarly writings have been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The New Republic, Poetry Magazine, the Paris Review, I'll stop now, and elsewhere. So it's a true delight to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Professor Martha S. Jones, is Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and one more, Professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story and the legacy and the ongoing activism of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. That came out appropriately in 2020. Remember, that was supposed to be the year of the woman? We're going to get our year. Promise. If you haven't read Vanguard, again, a really powerful kind of re-examination and reckoning with the long untold stories of Black women's advocacy, especially around suffrage. It was selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books. And as a public historian, she writes beautifully and eloquently for broader audiences, and joins Clint in writing for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, USA Today, and other outlets. So welcome, Martha. Last but certainly not least, it's an honor to bring to the stage for his pre-debut exposure at the Smithsonian, my friend Jorge Zamanillo. And Jorge is the executive director and CEO of HistoryMiami Museum and the incoming founding inaugural awesome director of the new Smithsonian National Museum of the American Latino. Woot.
Pressure's on.
Pressure's on, secret's out. Jorge began working at the museum in Miami in 2000 as a curator of object collections, and over time organized several key exhibitions and programs that moved the interpretation of that richly complicated city forward, and he still does. He's also included, among his efforts, included the full renovation of the museum's permanent exhibition, Tropical Dreams, A People's History of Southern Florida. He curated Operation Pedro Pan, the Cuban Children's Exodus, in 2015, among many other incredible works. Before he was promoted as executive director and CEO, he served several leadership positions at the museum, including deputy director, vice president of its expansion project, senior curator, and the list goes on. He currently serves as the treasurer of the American Alliance of Museums and the president of the Florida Association of Museums. So please give a warm welcome, a warm Smithsonian welcome to all three panelists. I'm really grateful to be here. I haven't done this in so long, and like personhood, okay, dimensions. So I'd like to start out with a question that picks up a little bit of what John said about the sheer number, 21,000, I think you mentioned, John, of history organizations in the United States. So the history enterprise in the United States is vast and varied as history itself. as James Baldwin so powerfully wrote in 1963, American history is longer, larger, more varied, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it. So if you think about the way in which history is enacted here, along with those 21,000 organizations, of course, university history departments, scholars, curators, educators. So the question is, how can we harness the energy of all of those people doing history, maybe believing in history, and their very differing viewpoints to answer the sage Baldwin for the good of the field, for the public, and the country. So how do we kind of bring them together and harness that? And maybe Jorge, you can start, and then please, Martha and Clint, you can either say, the Quaker friend speaks my mind, or you can chime in on the question. Yeah.
Thank you, Anthea. Speaking for museums, and smaller museums especially, which are going to have a challenge moving forward, especially over the past 2 years. I think Baldwin also said, history is not the past, it's the present. And I think that's key. I think for most museums, for history museums, it's embracing who your audience is and who your public is, and making sure you're communicating to them and they see themselves in these spaces, in these museum spaces. And that's been so key for us at our museum, in my current museum. I think our education department and our staff have done an incredible job using some of these critical thinking skills over the past few years. But now, all museums have this tool, this framework and the toolkit to go forward and encourage critical thinking and questioning the narrative that's on our walls for so many years. I was telling John earlier, many history museums have permanent, semi-permanent exhibits for 20, 30 years in their walls, and they're dated. They were dated the day they put them up, right? And now is a perfect opportunity to readdress, change labels, admit that some of the terminology and the words that are being used there are harmful, and the museums are causing some of that harm, but also take advantage of the opportunity to educate and get the feedback from the community on what they want to see at the local level. Because a lot of those local stories are really going to connect to the national stories and help spread that message about, look, I'm from Florida, so I know what critical thinking is. It's going to be an issue, right? Whatever I say is going to be...
the critical part.
Yeah, the critical part is it's vilified, right? And anytime that word comes up, and we've been using those terms for years in our museum. So we need to make sure that we're using this toolkit the right way and use these techniques, and it's going to work. And I really believe it's the right way to move forward.
Yeah.
For me, one of the things that I came away from these reports with was a sense that it was permission, in a sense, to take what I often am doing in a classroom, right, with 19 and 20-year-olds in a seminar. So it all resonated. But there is a different sort of challenge, I think, for an academic historian to take the kinds of postures, the kinds of sensibilities, the kind of critical thinking, the kind of hands-on that we do in the classroom into the public sphere. Somehow when we come out on a stage like this, or in our own books, our own articles, even our op-eds, we adopt a voice that's sort of omniscient, right, and chastising, and leans on notions like truth and absolutism. So I think there's a question for us, a continuing challenge, right, to take the ways we are already as educators and bring that into the public sphere. So I think it's an extraordinarily challenging moment, but it's a moment also when I think where we're challenged to expand the way we do our work.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Jorge said in terms of the way that museums need to respond to the communities they're a part of, respond to new information. And part of what I found, as I traveled across the country visiting these different historical sites, is that the best ones aren't static. and they recognize that they're not static. They recognize that like how they told the story 10 years ago is different than how they told the story 5 years ago, and is different than how they should tell the story now, right? They're responsive to new scholarship. They're responsive to new political frameworks. They're responsive to shifts in public consciousness. And I think the best museums, the best historical sites are the ones that are always constantly engaging in that process of self-reflection. And I think also thinking about the sort of institutional level reflection and investment and recognition of the way that an institution is meant to evolve over time. But I think that also is reflected in the investments you make in the people who are on the ground within your organizations doing that work. So constantly, the folks that I met who I was so moved by in these different historical sites were the guides and the docents. And I think that's part of what I found over and over again is that these were people who themselves were on their own sort of journey, right? They were on their own journey of learning and unlearning so much of what they had been taught growing up. And it is those folks who are engaging with the public. It's those folks who are engaging with the students in the field trips. It's those folks who, when I talk to people after a tour I went on, are like, wow, the way that guide or that docent talked about Jefferson or talked about Madison or talked about Washington or talked about slavery or talked about indigenous communities really did it in a way that I had never considered before. And so I think part of what institutions can, need to constantly make sure they're doing is really investing in the sort of pedagogical and professional development of the folks who are, again, seeing the public every single day, because it's those folks who have a really unique opportunity, I think, to change the minds of people who didn't even recognize that their minds needed to be changed, right? I think all the time about the people who stop at certain historical sites on their way from a winery or on their way from, a birthday party or, whatever, that might not be going to a site because they're specifically interested in thinking about critical history or trying to unlearn some of the harmful things that they may have believed before, but who might go there for other reasons and then come away maybe unexpectedly with a very different set of sensibilities around the history that they have been taught and perhaps understanding a sort of more expansive, as we've discussed, conception of history and how they fit into it.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you. And I think many of us are thinking about that, especially in historic sites and museums, with the real damage done through the pandemic and the ways in which we're coming back and trying to come back better and more sensitive, but also knowing that a lot of those incredible frontline workers were often the first to go. And so as we rebuild with hope, care, and compassion, but you're right, with an eye towards the type of interface that kind of public history delivery, right, that engagement, that one-on-one experience can bring to us. So it's I think, a particular challenge throughout the ways in which we've interpreted, and a very poignant one in this time of these cascading crises that we're still roiled in, viral, racial, economic, political, constitutional, climate. Did I say climate? So yeah, it's a great challenge. I'd like to move on. The report opens, and John, you highlighted this with this quote: "History is currently the subject of a high-profile political debate. With the New York Times 1619 Project, more recently the debates over critical race theory, history has become a lightning rod of political discourse," end quote. And I think we're all aware, history has its eyes on you, history's watching, history's going to judge. And my initial thought every time I hear that is that history doesn't do any of that. Historians do, people do, educators do, thinkers do, you do. And so think with me on how do we then go about a way, as historians and as thinkers and writers and educators, to address and utilize this moment, like take this energy where, history is all of a sudden may have its, he or she, they have their own place on the stage, but we all know that that's an easy way to say that we're judging or we're thinking. So how, maybe Martha, you can start, because especially in your classroom time, how have you kind of used this moment to pivot with people's interest in history? And I'd love for Clint, maybe you to go next in terms of your writings, but how do we use this moment?
One of the hats I wear at Johns Hopkins is I direct a project called Hard Histories at Hopkins.
Nice.
The genesis of our project was a unanticipated revelation in the midst of the pandemic about our founder and namesake,
Right.
who we had long promoted as a Quaker abolitionist, turned out, among other things, to be an enslaver. And there I was, hoping that what I was going to offer up was research, right? I was going to be a clinician. I could head to the archives. I could tell you what the documents meant. Well, you know how that went, right? It didn't go well at all. That no one was going to let you simply come in and offer some expertise and step out. But part of what I hope I've learned, first and foremost, is that in this work, which is very local and new for me as someone who has written on big topics and big geographies in much of her work, that the first and foremost, I have to be committed to the long term of this conversation and of this debate, that I have to commit to weathering the moments of discomfort, the moments of rebuke, and much more that have visited me and have visited this work. So that kind of commitment, I think, is new for me in my work, but has guided our project, and it has netted relationships. And so that's the other thing I want to put on the table, is that through this work, we have developed a set of friendships and alliances and partnerships with local institutions, our historic sites, our museums, and more, because it turns out we are all, at least in our own way, a part of this moment of reckoning, right? Johns Hopkins as an institution has its own history and its own approach to that. So part of it for us has been building relationships and building relationships around common challenges and common concerns, and around what it means to be a city, a locality, Baltimore as a very special and beautiful place, I have to say, that occupies a very twisted niche of the American imagination. We are all part of that challenge. So it's finding that common ground, and I think pulling back and helping folks and one another see the big picture, right, rather than what troubles us on a given day, about what a census return might or might say about a once revered figure. But it's a long investment, and we're up to here in it, right? We don't just, we're not dilettantes in and out, and for a lot of us, that's new.
Well, and if I may, building on that, thank you so much for that. It was poignant and very much lived. I think it also indicates your commitment to the community, which I think if I'm reading you correctly, Martha, it is that as historians, especially in grad school, we're trained to float in these intellectual helicopters above the land. We can land anywhere. We can do our thing. We can then, rise up and move over. And I think for many of us, that hasn't rung true for a long time, maybe in our work, or maybe more recently we've realized that the type of community engagement, the deep, the long, the lasting, the commitment to our communities, I think is really powerful. It doesn't mean, as your work has done, Clint, that getting out and doing this incredible field work that you did brings you closer, right, to a very dynamic and broad canvas. So on that canvas on which you paint, share with us maybe some thoughts too on how do we use this moment? How do we come to this?
It's going to be hard for me to not use this entire conversation just to endlessly praise docents and tour guides and public historians.
We will take it. We're good.
But I just, what I found over and over again, and I tried to model the sensibilities of my book after this, was that the best guides, the best people who changed minds and moved the folks who were spending time with them, whether it was 30 minutes, an hour and a half, are the folks who both extended a level of grace and generosity to the people who were with them, but also demanded a level of accountability and responsibility, which is to say, when the best docents I saw were never people who were going to judge folks for showing up and not knowing information. We're never going to be condescending toward people. We're never going to imply that whatever information they're sharing with you is something that you should have known. But there's the expectation that once they share that information with you, that you have to sit with it. That you have to, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it's jarring, even if it runs counter to all of the other stories and information you've been told your entire life. But I think that people are more willing to accept it and sit with it if a level of generosity and grace has been extended to them, which is to say you just have to meet people where they are, which can be hard, especially if people are carrying views and conceptions of history that are harmful, right? But I think the people who do it best are people who recognize that in their own lives, people have extended a certain level of grace and generosity toward them in moments when they might not have known something that perhaps somebody thought they should have known. But it, again, is not a sort of like an empty grace or an empty generosity. It's one that says, okay, we are sort of on this journey alongside one another, and I'm here with you, but you also have to walk. Like, I'm not going to pick you up and do the walking for you, not on the tour or intellectually. So I think that is a sort of pedagogical practice, if you will, that I think is really important, because part of what stops a lot of people from wanting to engage with difficult histories is the feeling of feeling judged and feeling shame. And I don't even think shame is necessarily a bad emotion. I think shame can be useful sometimes, but when it prevents people from even being willing to access or engage with the information, then I think it loses its utility. So yeah, the sort of both-andedness of generosity, but also accountability.
Yeah, and I do like that combination of grace and accountability. I think that's poignant. And Chris Wilson, who I think is still in the House, who directs our African American history programs, and a lot of our programs on the floor, I think would echo that when we do join the student sit-in, and we actually take visitors who don't know that what they're going to get and take them to the Greensboro lunch counter here, that it, in a very kind of careful, very thoughtful way, opens up those spaces in which people can be vulnerable. They can encounter their own biases. They can encounter their own pain. They can encounter their own fears. With your readers, do you find that it's a different type of engagement, obviously, than field engagement, but do you see your work also filling some of those gaps?
I hope so.
Yeah, the ones you hear from. Yeah.
I think people often ask about the audience of the book, and I always tell people that it's a 16-year-old version of me, right? I think I wrote the book because I desperately, it's that sort of old Toni Morrison adage where if there's a book you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you need to be the one to write it. Yeah. And I think many writers, certainly writers who come from historically marginalized and oppressed communities whose stories have not been told, take that adage very seriously and carry it with them in their creative work. And so for me, I recognized that I did not understand the history of slavery in any way that was commensurate with the impact that it had on this country. And so the book is written from someone who I did not get a PhD in history. I got a PhD in sociology of education, spent a lot of time in graduate school thinking about prisons and the carceral state, which is obviously adjacent, but is also different. And so for me, I tried to write a book that was saying, I'm going to these places and learning this information at the same time my reader is, and hopefully being honest about the things that were surprising for me, the things that were distressing for me, the things that were jarring for me, the things that were exciting for me, allows them a little bit of emotional space to have their own emotional reactions to the things that they're reading about or seeing. And I really think that there are more people who just don't know information, or don't even know that they don't know sets of information or parts of history, than who are inherently antagonistic toward that. I mean, those people certainly exist, and we see them in all parts of our political discourse. But I also think that there are far more people who are open to new information, but who just haven't encountered it, again, going back to what I was talking about before, encountered it in a way that allows them to hear it. Which isn't to say that you sort of bend to, you figure out ways to water down what you're saying. I think you can figure out how to engage, how to take accessibility seriously, without sort of watering down the historical or intellectual rigor of what you're trying to convey.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Smith. And I think the toolkit in particular of the accompaniment to the report gives a lot of great ways in terms of those kind of the examples that it lays out for us to turn those conversations, right? And it does rely, though, back to your point, on that kind of one-on-one engagement, but I do think there's ways that we magnify that, right? Yeah. Did you want to echo that, Martha?
I did, because one of the most frequent comments, it's sort of, it's question time, but it's actually comment time, that.
Yeah.
And
that
the most frequent comment I get is, I didn't learn this in school, or this isn't the way I learned it in school. And, I think once upon a time, my instinct was to kind of double down on my expertise, and kind of roll back, the lecture one more time, right, to help, a student, an audience member, get it right. But now my response to that is, I didn't either. Right, I didn't either, and
I didn't
now
learn it till grad school, right?
We have common ground, and I can talk about process, right? I can talk about my own road to critical thinking, right? And we're part of a journey together instead of sort of me, the expert, dispensing knowledge, and we've been on Zoom a long time, so it remains to be seen. But I think that it really does reset the table in my conversations with folks, and is an opening, right, for them to sort of pick up some of those tools and do the critical thinking that they need to do, right, which might not be the same as what I need to do.
Right. Yeah, different parts of your journey. Yeah, but engaging then and finding that, to your point, Clint, that common ground, and your own vulnerabilities that I often think of why did I have to learn, X, A through Z, in grad school. And I do think the bridges that we build as public historians and public intellectuals are absolutely essential. I do feel sometimes that we're taking that scholarship and putting it, not distilling it, not in any way demeaning it or reducing it, but actually putting it into spaces. And Jorge, if you want to then maybe share some of those spaces that you've seen in your museum, or even that you anticipate on a national scale.
Just tailgate. It has to be personal. The stories have to be personal in order to get across, get your message across. And I think it's one of the challenges that we've had as from the History Museum standpoint. It's my story. Going back to high school, I didn't like history. I never did well in it because I just didn't see that connection, right? It wasn't personal enough for me. And we see that at the museum too. Whenever we have a successful exhibit or a program, it's because it was a personal story. It was a personal connection you made, going back to Clint. And that's so important. And also, that's part of the toolkit, that you have to make those personal connections and share those stories. And have a solution, and have a possible solution to what you're addressing, right? I know when we did the Operation Pedro Pan exhibition years ago, that's why it worked. But not only did we tell the story of that it was an immigration story, it was an international relations story, it was story of unaccompanied minors, and it was so timely at the time. It was timely because children were being forced to stay in camps without their parents, crossing the border, and all these connections. And so it was a local story that suddenly had a national connection, and that was so important. But then through our programming, we also make sure to come up with that solution you mentioned in this toolkit. we had what's going on today with children and children's welfare, and that's where we addressed, how to address current events and things that you could connect to what's happening today, and that's crucial. It's not only about the past, but also about the present.
And I just want to say one more thing about the vulnerability and honesty piece. I think about probably the foremost young adult writer today is a guy named Jason Reynolds. And the thing that is so, part of it is he just oozes cool. Like, you look at him, you're like, you're the coolest person I've ever seen.
Ever you write.
Yeah. And the other part of it, I think part of the reason young people are so drawn to not only his books, but also to him, is because he's really honest about his own journey as a reader and a writer. And he's like, I didn't like reading growing up. Like, I grew up and I didn't like reading. I liked playing basketball. I didn't like doing this. But I think I figured out how to write the sort of stories, again, going back to what we were saying, that I wish I had been able to read when I was 12, 13, 14, 15. And I think just that sentence, just like, I didn't like reading, but now I think I figured, but now I do, and now I know the sort of stories I wish had been written. Just give young people an entry point to say, like, oh, well, if he's a writer selling millions of copies of his books and, like, on TV with Oprah and doing, and, like, maybe I can still be that, right? Like, maybe it sort of removes whatever barriers a young person might have put up. And I think, again, I see the same thing with, these historical sites, where the best folks that I was watching were people who, as Martha said, was like, I didn't learn this either. I didn't know this. I didn't learn this. And they also give a timeline. I remember a woman at Monticello, Teresa, who I met and had an extended conversation with, and she's like, I just learned some of this 2 weeks ago, and it's blowing my mind. And it just creates a level of humility, right?
Yes.
And approach and makes it feel like these aren't like, docents who have come from the mountains of Monticello to, like, share their wisdom with you. It's like, these are people who are also at the soccer game with their kids and grandkids, and also at the grocery store, and also, like, read the Annette Gordon Reed book, and we're like, man, that's wild. Nobody told me this. And I think that shared sort of collective recognition that, like, that you're always still learning about it, right? And you're always still figuring it out. And in the same way that it is shocking to you, it was really shocking to me at the same time. Just like giving people permission to have their own emotional responses, and not making it seem as if, like, we all came out of the womb reading Baldwin or Audre Lorde, and that that the whole thing is a journey, and it's an ongoing journey that never stops.
And that we discover that at different moments in our lives at which it made a real difference, right? It changed us, and I think that kind of testimonial is critical. I like to think of history as a verb and democracy as a verb, right? We need to, actually enact it and use it so often. I'd like to go a little bit to history's, one of history's ingredients in the great stew, primary sources, because I think that one of the really moments that struck me in both the report and the toolkit was the understanding, and Sam Weinberg and others have written so much about this, with the explosive access to primary sources. Museums, archives, repositories trying to expand dramatically our access to primary sources, especially through digitization. So we can access primary sources so much easier, but of course it also opens up inordinate space for misinformation. And there's a accompanying expansion and accessibility that then is sadly echoed with a skepticism of expertise. There's an incredible desire to do one's own research. And Martha, you've already touched on this brilliantly. And even when some of the questions we think have already been answered as historians, we see this kind of replowing a lot of fields. So what does it mean for us to do history in all the ways in which we do, at a time when you can encourage people to both engage with the source material, but then also want them to believe in institutions, believe in our own frailties, of course, as institutions and as historians. So talk to me maybe a little bit about that tension?
I'll jump in to say
You go.
that one of the things many things I didn't anticipate in the work we do at Hard Histories, but one of them was that it is certainly the case that, anyone with a URL can set up the counter site and write something that they call history. What to do? I can tell you how I came down on this. What I was never going to do was become the heavy-handed, bat-wielding historian who has a skill set that includes dismantling someone's homespun website, right? That I just wasn't going to be that person. Perhaps it's just not my temperament. It actually is my temperament, let me be honest.
Working against yourself here.
I'm actually working against my inclination because what I don't want to do is create a climate in which the curious, the uninitiated, the novice, right, wants to come to the primary materials and muck around and see, so I thought if I get into that sort of contest with someone who has created a homespun website, I discourage other folks from ever at least coming out from behind their screens, right, and being part of the conversation. So what to do? For me, it's part of this, I don't know if it's the solution, but my strategy and my approach has been to be a lot more public in a casual way. I have a Substack now, and twice a week I come on the stack, as they call it, and I sort of blog, and it goes out to a very limited readership, and I blog about what we're doing in the lab, I blog about the sources, I blog about Clint because he's come to Baltimore and he's done a talk. Then I have to sort of meet that kind of casual publicness with my own version of that it honors my bounds and my integrity, but also is willing to sort of be accessible and in the conversation day in and day out. If you waited for me to say everything I might say or could say in a scholarly journal,
it might take you a little
God
while.
help us, right? Because it takes,
I'll see you
it just
in
takes a very long
2024,
time. And that's not the pace at which many folks are coming to the work. So it is really it's not my nature, and it's not the way I was trained, but I do think to stand back a bit and to find other voices and other modes of expression, I hope is catching on, right? And
I think so. If I may, if you think of the ways in which we engage about 10 to 12 million people online through the American History Museum, and that doesn't count all my incredible colleagues at other museums and Smithsonian and otherwise. And so we think very thoughtfully. What do you put on Twitter? What do you put on long form Instagram? What the social media strategies that we've all gotten accustomed to. But I want to go back to something that struck me. If there's any digital archivists in the room, they're probably going, metadata. Talk to me about metadata. I know you want me to. Because I think what we find as we digitize more and more primary sources is that people don't necessarily want the interpretation. Some do. Some want to go deep, and they want to go deep into the historiography, and they know what that word means, and they want that. But for a lot of people, they do want to kind of curate. They do want to move around. They do want to engage differently, and then go on those wonderful deep dives down research rabbit holes in their own ways. And I do think that making sure that our primary sources are placed online in ways that tether them back to the reality and to the veracity of the archive. I think we owe that to our publics as a way in which at least we can try and maintain the legitimacy of the primary sources. Not to get really wonky, but I know I'm in a room full of lovely other fellow wonks. But I love what you're saying, too, about the working out of our comfort zones, and I think that's essential engaging the conversations like the ones that we've mentioned here today and that the report does such a good job on. Yeah. Anything that you wanted to add to that, Jorge?
Yeah, you're right. You know, everybody walking around today with a powerful computer in their pocket, you know, and looking up everything you do and trying to correct you. I see young people do it all the time. I feel like an old man, but I see my daughter, you know, you're watching a movie and they're looking up to see what actor is on this movie and where they played in before and where they starred in before. It's addictive, right? And you're always constantly trying to second guess everyone. So I've been giving this so much thought over the past few months, especially with the daunting task of building a new museum. And what does it mean for a museum in post-pandemic era and in the 21st century? How does it emerge as a different institution than what we're used to, right? And does it include this visitor experience where, I hate to use the word Wikipedia, but is it crowdsourced? Is there content that's going to be being fed into these experiences where it's not only the scholarship, it's not only the curators providing the narrative, but it's constantly being modified, and we're being nimble and quick about adapting and not having these outdated exhibitions. So it's all these. That's what I'm thinking. That's the direction I've been really giving a lot of thought to, because it's you can't say no to it. It's just going to happen. It's, you know, people learning things, and 2 weeks later they're providing that information to other people. You know, same thing. You pick up your phone, you look it up, and you can say, well, that's not really the way it happened. At least not. I don't believe it is, right? So it's going to be really interesting moving forward the next few years. I really see museums in the next 5-10 years is being completely different on how they provide information.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah. And I think that will, at least for the foreseeable future, will be, to your point, mediated by the remarkableness that is handheld, our handheld computers.
And I think part of it is recognizing too that, like, and this is what we're alluding to, but that is the way that the vast majority of people will encounter primary source documents.
Yep.
Now.
Right.
I mean, I think about, even before I started writing How the Word is Passed, there was an account called, I don't know what specifically it was called, but it was, I think, Information Wanted. And it was about the ads that formerly enslaved people created or put in newspapers looking for their loved ones after the end of the Civil War. Yeah. And I never encountered anything like that. And it just completely, you know, I'm scrolling down, and I think, you know, somebody retweeted it, and I looked at it, and it just, I don't know in which context I would have otherwise encountered that information without, you know, then going on to write a book about it. But I just remember that in that moment, in that sort of like 5 minutes I spent then like clicking on the profile and like scrolling down and reading the other ads, that like my very conception of the institution of slavery had like profoundly shifted, because you know, just in that context, my previous sense of what slavery was always in the frame of the sort of spectacle of violence, right? And that is the way that it had been portrayed to me, and the way that to the extent that I was taught about it, that is how it had been taught, like the beatings, the violence, the sort of omnipresent, just physical brutality. Sure. And I had never thought about family separation with the same level of rigor or depth, and just encountering the ads that are, you know, ostensibly in the voices of enslaved people who are like, I haven't seen my son in 40 years, but I think he might be in Virginia, or he might, you know, just, I mean, it tore at my heart in ways that I had not experienced before. I remember discovering the Declarations of Confederate Secession for the first time in a blog by Ta-Nehisi in like 2014. And I was like, they just said it? Like nobody, you know, it was so like, you know, I was like, wait, they just said it. It's like right there. Yeah. And I grew up in a city in New Orleans that was one of the largest slave market in the country. And I never encountered anything like that. I grew up surrounded by Confederate iconography, and the sort of mythology of the lost cause was omnipresent within even my city, and the way that I was taught. And I was just like, how is this the first time, you know, as a almost 30-year-old, that I'm encountering this information that would have been so transformative for me as a young person. I mean, that would have completely recalibrated my understanding of like what that P.G.T. Beauregard statue in the middle of City Park meant. And you know, for me, it always comes back to thinking about, again, like this is why I wrote the book, for the 16-year-old version of me, like what sort of primary source documents can you provide young people that will help them make sense of why the world looks the way that it does. And I think that figuring out ways to creatively share that information. Obviously, social media is a huge part of that. But I think, you know, there are teachers now who are like make their kids do, like, because and with TikTok, you can like put you can put documents behind you, and the kids are like making TikToks with like the Declaration of Independence behind. I mean, there's so many creative ways to think about how to use primary source documents now that make people feel like they are actively engaging with the history rather than sort of passively receiving it.
Yeah, I think we've all felt that sense of those documents and those sources being unlocked. And I also think, to your point about that, and to yours as well, Martha, it then also helps us get into and start exploring and start challenging ourselves and others and our publics around what's missing, right? The silencing and the silences in the archives and in the record, which I think we can turn. I think a lot of what the report does, and again, congratulations to the frameworks and to the trio of organizations who work so hard on it, but I think what it then enables us to do is to really think about the ways in which that kind of citizen history, right? You know, the lowercase c, the participatory, and I don't, you know, Jorge, you mentioned crowdsourced, and I think we're learning a lot about what, you know, the crowd and the hive mind can do, but if we go back to the principles of community-based history and really engage and really dig and find those stories, the painful ones, the joyous ones, the connections that we build, I think are really powerful. Yeah. Mentions of, back to the report and the framework, and this could be intentional, but I want to ask our panelists kind of some of their reflections. Overt mentions of race, class, gender, ethnicity, you know, what social historians and social scientists cut their teeth on, are lacking, or generally kind of lacking or subsumed in the report and the frameworks. And think with me a bit about at what cost, right? The hope is that the frameworks will be disseminated incredibly broadly. We're all working on doing just that as a way to engage and reframe the conversation around history. But how do we ensure that the very sense of equity and justice that runs, the deep rivers that run through our work are represented? Anybody can take that one.
That's a tough one.
I know, I saved it for, when we're well into the conversation. Yeah.
I think it's individual. Every museum, well, at least museums, they have to adapt to how they're going to use this framework and where their needs are at the time. If they're using it for, we're doing an exhibit on Queer Miami years ago. That would have been a perfect time to bring in the right people, consultants, and lead these conversations with that framework in mind, but also other topics. I think every museum is just going to have to take it up in case-by-case basis and adapt it to their mission and their organization. For us, it's a little easier, I think, for museums. I'm not sure for you.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a question that I can't answer, about how, are those questions, I don't know, are they the hot buttons? Are they the third rails? Yeah. I think it's an interesting question, what we leave out, right? And I think there's some important wisdom, as I want to echo your point, I think, if I understand it, which is that those are the kinds of conversations. I'm thinking of, Michelle Norris's great work in the Race Card Project, right? Which was really intended to, in community, right, in fellowship for folks to sit down and have those intimate conversations about race and racism, their own lives, their own views, their own histories. I think maybe there's some wisdom to that, but I guess I worry because I think that those are, right, the third rail questions. They're third rail questions for our students. Maybe they're third rail questions for, our institution heads. They're third rail questions, in a public forum. How do we talk about racism? How do we talk about sexism? And so for me, maybe with all due respect, right, I think there is a, I guess for me, the frame I would offer it is, where is the place for courage in this work, right? Where is the place for being the folks who create the space, right? Who invite and facilitate and at least give us the possibility, right, of a different kind of understanding around some of the most difficult questions that animate our lives and animate our institutions.
Right. And the paradoxes that undergird our very form of government. And, Any thoughts?
I'd only add that, I think ongoing reflection, has to undergird everything we do, regardless of if, as writers, museum heads, scholars. I think if you're not always thinking about the voices that you are including and the voices you are not including in every exhibit, in every essay, in all of these different contexts, I think that it is just an ongoing effort to think critically within yourself and within your own work, and to say, like, what is missing here, what's not missing, what's appropriate to include, what's not. Again, just in my own book, again, it is not, for example, about Indigenous history, but it felt very clear to me that I had to gesture toward that, or to nod toward that, or to include a recognition of the fact that even at the beginning of the book that, this is not a book about Indigenous history, but because it's so place-based, all of the places that I went, are places that were occupied by Indigenous communities long before slavery was even brought to this continent, long before any Europeans came here, and even when I'm talking about Jefferson, or when I'm talking about Lincoln, or when I'm talking about some of these, Angola, to think about the sort of complexity that exists within the respective histories of each of those. Because if I'm saying, Lincoln was great on this, I'm thinking of like a young Indigenous person reading that and be like, well, Lincoln wasn't great, on Indigenous removal. And you don't have to make the whole thing about it, but I just think just like acknowledgments and gestures and things to demonstrate that you are thinking about and cognizant of the complexity of all of it, right? Like, history is complex, and history is full of cognitive dissonance, and history is messy, and just, to the extent that we can recognize that certain parts of in such different eras, different parts of history, impacted different communities in unique and different ways, I think will just make the people we're engaging with feel more seen, and push them to do that on their end more as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you both, and thank you all three. I do think, too, that the toolkit and the report urge us to find pathways in communities and in communication that resonate. And so I think for me, for a long time, especially in the West, and I try and do in the Western United States and territories, really thinking about those places as very layered. Most people get layers, right? You can use cake metaphors, you can use all kinds of great things for layers. And, but that the layered complexity of the past, right? And like who lived here before, and what did they do, and what did they care about? They're going to generally care about some of the same things, which like why reading the accounts of formerly enslaved people, you know, so desperately searching for their loved ones rings a bell. We've all felt that sense of loss and grief, but you know, that those layers I think are so critical. You touched on something, a couple. We've touched on something together a number of times. I want to bring it into narrative a bit. How do we reconcile an American history that tells kind of everyone's story and in which everyone is reflected, they see themselves in that as agents and as participants, with the kind of meta shared national narrative, again, that we've all grown up with, is an inclusive history that the report, you know, makes an incredibly cogent and articulate case for? Is that at odds with a unified national story? Can we have both? Should we even be asking that same, is that even the right question anymore in 2022?
You know, I think that...
Think big with me.
Yeah, no, I always think about just the difference, how America is a place that is built, it is built on aspirations that it is not lived up to, right? And we are constantly chasing those aspirations. Our founding documents are aspirational documents. Our founders were people with aspirational conceptions of freedom and justice and equality that they often did not live up to within their own lives. And I think that we can praise the promise and the aspirations of our country while recognizing the, you know, again, complexity and the ways that the very people who created these, you know, promises were failing to live up to it themselves. And, you know, again, it just goes to making sure that we teach history as not a sort of cleanly demarcated set of ideas and moments, and you know that everything is linear. That we teach about how the people who founded the social contract upon which this country is based had specific ideas of who they did and didn't want included as the beneficiaries of that contract. And so we can praise the contract and then also say the contract is, you know, not everybody got to sign it, or not everybody was thought about as being part of it. So yeah, I think we can, you know, recognize that there's that the ideas that undergird this experiment are worthy ones, and the reality is that we're still chasing that.
Yeah, it's not a complete narrative. It's not exactly.
In a way, you know, Clinton and Jorge and Martha, I wonder if just what you articulated and Secretary Lonnie Bunch has articulated it, and you know, let us use history to hold the nation up to its highest ideals, right? So it's both the introspective look and the work of history then to push that nation forward into that. I getting ready for this panel, in a way that's become kind of our new big narrative, I think. Maybe it's because I'm with my, like, you know, I'm with my, you know, family here, but I have found that different versions of what you've just said and what my paraphrasing of what Lonnie said, what I think we've all probably said in our classrooms and in our books and on our museum walls, to start kind of, we've shifted the big progressive meta-narrative of history being this timeline, right, of history being this great march towards progress, to a more nuanced position, like you just articulated, because we don't disregard our core belief in the promise. I don't know, what do you think, Martha? You think a lot about this.
I do.
Yeah.
And since you're asking me today, I'll tell you what I think, you know, which is, for me, I think the story is not about an arc. It is not about chasing an ideal. It is a story about the nature of this democracy, which I think is defined by the debates over those ideals. And as I was listening, I was thinking, I need a better word, because I think the word debate has a connotation, right? That it's too close to disagreement, right? It's too close to contentiousness.
Sounds like critical.
Yeah, and uncomfortably so. But for me, I think that if I, as a historian, could gift us something, right, a shared something, it would be an ease, more ease with the notion that in every generation we debate fundamental questions: who belongs, who votes, who, we do that, and that is the nature of this democracy, and we can expect that, anticipate it, but also maybe even welcome it, right? That for me, it's not the narrative that says it's always struggle, right? Like, I'm really not trying to take us there, though I know there are folks that do. But I am trying to help us not only appreciate, but to be more at ease with what it means to seemingly again and again in each generation ask old questions. But I think that is the nature of an old democracy, which we have become.
Right, and one of the longest standing. Yeah. In Vanguard, though, you also make the accompanying point that it is not, if it were not for the determined, dogged advocacy of so many, especially Black women, to get the vote, in the case of that scholarship, and I think you could argue that for so many other times in our history, it's the pushing of the envelope of exclusion, right? Just that kind of constant advocacy. I wonder sometimes if we taught more about that advocacy and that courage, to your earlier point, Martha, that we would see, that people could see and not be as afeared of peaceful protest, of the getting out, of the kind of claiming of rights, if it was seen as a long continuum, and again, pushing and pushing to answer those questions maybe slightly differently, or to include more and more people into the embrace of the democratic experiment. I don't know, Jorge, what do you think?
I'm curious what's going to happen next 3, 4, 5 years as we lead up to the 250th of our country. What does that mean? I was too young when the 200th was around, but to know how the country reacted. But now with social media and these platforms, are people going to rise and have a say on what we strive to be a more perfect union, and what does that mean for them? Yeah. I know as part of Made by Us, of another group we're part of, we've been striving to learn from younger audiences how they engage with history, but it's going to be striking. Really, I think it really is. This time around.
Yeah. You guys are wonderful. Take a little sip of water. We have a bit more time. When a number of you also, thank you, submitted questions to us prior to this event, and we also will leave some time for questions live. And there are a great many. Some I hope we've touched on. Let's see. This is, I think, a fabulous one. What advice can the panelists share to help historians and our audiences engage both the dominant and the oppressed narratives of a shared past in ways that produce deeper understandings of the complex relationship between these intertwined stories? The dominant and the oppressed narratives. I would think maybe dominant and oppressed peoples, too, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think? We have some very smart people in the audience.
And I think we've alluded to it a bit, but I think for me, talking about for me, something that's really important in history is with the same thing that I mentioned as being important in the context of museums and historical sites, which is a recognition that people aren't static. right? And that people change and that people evolve. So if we're, if I'm thinking about how you teach, Lincoln, I don't know how you teach, the way that I was taught about Lincoln is that he's a great emancipator, freed the slaves, he's so great, top hat, amazing.
It's upstairs.
Is it upstairs?
Yeah.
The actual top hat?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
That he was wearing the night he was assassinated.
I was like, do I have to put my kids to bed tonight? And so, I think when you tell the story of Lincoln, you tell the story of a man. In order to tell the story honestly, you tell the story of a man who thought about slavery and who thought about black people very differently in 1850 than he did in 1865, and that he's a person, right? And that how we think about things is different than how today is different than how we thought about it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, that
and I think that a recognition that people within history aren't static. It can help us understand history more broadly as not being static, as being a constant, as Martha alluded to, a constant set of contradictions, a constant sort of debate, a constant push and pull, a constant tug of war, if you will, and that tug of war exists on a sort of meta societal level, but also a tug of war within people, right? And within ourselves, within the historical actors who are present in these moments. I just think that makes it feel more intimate. It makes it feel more real. And you teach Jefferson, you teach Lincoln as saying in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that he never thought that black people should live near. He never because he's anti-slavery doesn't mean that he was pro-franchise, pro-black people on juries, pro-marrying black people, pro-living next to black people, or any of that. And then talk about how in 1865, after conversations with Douglas, after watching black soldiers in the Civil War, after a whole host of things, his mind began to change. And to some extent, we'll never know the extent to which it would have changed because he was assassinated less than a week after the war ended. But that feels important to me because, we're not engaging with history or historical actors as sort of two-dimensional caricatures of themselves, but instead as complex three-dimensional people in a really complex three-dimensional world.
Right, like we are.
Great point.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience? We both have cards if you want to write, and we have microphones.
Yeah, one over here.
And then we have
Hello.
my ringer down there. Yes, hello.
I wrote down a note because I tend to be very long-winded and riff in uncomfortable situations. So let's hope this cuts it down.
Well, first be comfortable.
Yes.
And welcome.
Feel comfortable. Hi, I'm Carmen Bolt. I am a PhD student and an independent historian here in DC.
Great.
So this whole conversation about reframing history, about having a new framework for approaching the public, all of our publics with history, and concerns about bias have me wondering, how do we as public history practitioners within various institutions grapple with our positionality in local spaces and communities, right? We're talking about pulling in stories that resonate, right? But we say we're presenting history to the public, perhaps working off the premise of an idea of shared authority, which I think a lot of us as public historians were, raised into.
And the guy who wrote the book is here.
Yeah, Michael
Filing.
We've been in many of the same spaces. Is the assumption that groups, that our communities, our local communities, need us, public history practitioners, to share their stories inherently problematic? Does that not contribute to the idea that there is a bias within historical institutions or historians or practitioners, the fact that we ourselves need to be in that space at all? I'm wondering if maybe the new framework, maybe a part of this new framework, which I admittedly haven't read yet, but will, or even thinking beyond that, if there is a framework that in which we as practitioners make space available and make resources available to community members, but step back and make space for those individuals to tell their lived experience, their lived history in real time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, that was still long-winded, but thank you for humoring me.
No, sure. Thank you, Sarah. And I think that for many people in the audience who could answer that, and I think of like the great work that the Anacostia Community Museum is doing, literally, weaving in, listening deeply and carefully, the great work that Lonnie and his team, some of whom are here, did in laying all of the groundwork, laying all of the listening and all of the embrace to create the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But I think it's a great question. What do you guys,
Yeah, I think you answered part of it. We provide the platform, and we provide the venue, right, for these stories to be shared. We have a program called Miami Stories. We've collected over 600 stories in the past 11 years of, who are you, where you're from, what part of, how do you want to share your story about being in Miami, coming to Miami, arriving here. And it's so popular. And now, during the pandemic, of course, we expanded that to video submissions, and they're shared on our local national public radio affiliate. We have our own Miami Stories recording booth we take out to events. And it's become so popular because people do want to share their accounts, and they want to be part of history. They want to commit to being a part of our museum. So that demand is there, so we're responding to that. But they're not edited. Whatever they submit is what we share. There's very little editing, and we cut it down to 500 words maybe if they've gone over. But that's about it. And that's what they want to see. They want to see authentic storytelling and sharing. So that's worked for us.
and that
this is one example.
blossomed, I think, across the nation here and elsewhere through the pandemic, when that digital story collecting, which had already been, of course, a growing and really powerful and beautiful practice, really expanded. I think, how do we carry that forth in terms of that? Maybe that's one of your questions, right? Giving people those opportunities, making that those venues, right? Those rivulets. Yeah.
And I forgot to mention, and preserving them. Right, because we're doing that. And the key thing is, if we're not there and they're sharing the stories, where are they going to be saved for future generations to?
Right.
Yeah.
Which gets in then to our responsibility, as stewards of those collections, especially born digital collections, which is which is challenging. Yeah, Martha, what are you going to say?
I thank you for the comment question, and the piece I want to pick up on is on positionality, and where is the space, where is the place for situating ourselves in the work. I was certainly trained now quite a while ago not to situate myself in the work and to subordinate myself or to disappear myself, and that's part of where my authority came from, in part, right, was that my knowledge, my expertise was disembodied in that way. And I just don't write that way anymore. I don't work that way anymore. And if you read me, you will almost invariably find me situating myself in the work. But I have a couple of reflections. One is that, and we haven't really touched on it, but I want to just make a little space for it, which is to talk about vulnerability and our own vulnerabilities, right? That there is, I'm going to venture, right? There's no one on this stage, right? And many of us in the audience, right, are not assumed to be the best interpreters, the best experts, the best, right? That we have, we confront a great deal, or I'll speak for myself, right? I confront many, many doubters. And so there is something challenging, right, about situating myself and speaking in the eye, right, and stepping out from behind the veil or the curtain of expertise. And I think we have to be mindful of that and careful with that on the one hand. And on the other hand, I will just say for me that extraordinary things happen when I speak in the eye and I put myself in the story in some way. And the folks who show up, right, and then share, right, their story. Now, I'm self-conscious of saying any of this next to Clint, who has just produced this extraordinary book where he is everywhere. And I don't know if you feel vulnerability, but, we come to see you, and we can't help but see you. And But for me, there has been incredible, the rewards have been incredible because it brings me a different kind of audience. Because I let people see who I am and how I come to the work and what the work means to me and how I see myself in it, and it's extraordinary. But I think it's not risky. And I wonder if did you grapple with? Now I'm sorry, I don't mean to usurp, but did you grapple with a sense of vulnerability in putting yourself front and center in this extraordinary history that you tell?
It's very kind of you to say. Did I grapple with it? I kind of don't know. I was trained by sociologists who pushed me to think about positionality all the time. And so I don't really know what it means to try to write a book like this or to try to write anything. I mean, in some ways I'm very different than a lot of my colleagues at the Atlantic who write about similar issues, because if you read any of my work, like, I am very present in these stories, in part because I don't know how to tell the story without being honest about how my presence is part of the landscape and part of the ecosystem, right? Inevitably, when I enter a space, I change the space. As I talk about in How the Word Is Passed, like, the way that book looked would have been very different if it had been a white woman going on all these tours, or if it had been a white man, or a younger person, or an older person, or a queer person. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think about this Alfred Lord Tennyson poem a lot, Ulysses, and one of the lines in this, I think it's the 16th line in the first stanza, he says, "I am a part of all that I have met." And that's kind of like my thesis statement as like a person. Like, all of us we bring all of our experiences, all of our conversations, all of our, the people we've met and the things that we've done to anything we do, to anything we interact with. So for me, it is inevitable that when I'm at this plantation, or I'm at a prison or historical site anywhere, that I am bringing my own set of experiences, my own baggage, my own ancestry, my own lineage to those spaces. And I'm trying to write a piece right now about, for the Atlantic, about how Germany memorializes the Holocaust, because part of what How the Word Is Passed has done is like given me a lot of. I'm really interested in what the sort of international iteration of that looks like. Like, how do different nation states account for their past crimes against humanity through the memorials or the monuments and the museums they build. So I went to Berlin for about a week in the fall and visited all these monuments and historical sites and all these different things. And it, as I write the story, it is impossible for me to write that story without thinking about, when I see a Stolperstein, when I see a stumbling stone, it's impossible for me to write about it without thinking about what it would look like if we did that here, right, with enslaved people or indigenous people. It's impossible for me to go to the Memorial of the Murdered Jews of Europe and look around at all those columns and think, like, what would it look like if they did this in the middle of New York City for people who had been enslaved? So I think I have to be honest about that. I don't know what it would mean, and I think somebody with a different set of lived experiences, a different background, would and should go write the story in a way that is reflective of that. And as a sort of, in a technical way, part of why I think it's important, and I mentioned this before, is like, I think being honest about how you are emotionally, intellectually, physically responding to something that you see or that you read or that you hear gives your reader or your audience permission to do that on their own end. And I think for me that's a really important part of my writing.
Yeah, thank you both. And certainly what Brian Stevenson is doing in Montgomery, and that visualization of especially around lynching, but you're right, and kind of that sense of place-based recognition and atonement that we have not yet grappled with.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Just legal scholar Jerome Culp wrote about the power of silence. And what Culp would say is that, some of us, by virtue of our silence, construct our privilege, right? That folks come and assume, right, authority, expertise, experience, and more. And others of us don't live by virtue of that kind of assumption. But part of what Comp wants to do is challenge those of us who are silent, right? Because what he says is it's far more powerful as a matter of humanity, right? For us to, it turns out, you know, most folks who benefit from the silence don't actually come from autobiographies that comport, right, with the assumptions about who they are, how they came to be there, and more, and that we do something very powerful when we break that silence and we situate ourselves, but we do so fully. And Culp was an African-American law professor back in the 1980s when that was a rare thing, especially in elite law schools. And he began every class with an introduction of himself, and the introduction was, "I am the son of a poor coal miner." And it was true, but the reason he shared it was because even that defied like the kinds of assumptions that he knew his students were bringing. And so how do we, right, as curators, as, you know, docents, as writers, as interpreters, just allow enough of ourselves to come through so that we break that, that lousy habit without, you know, sort of, I don't know, saying too much. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said. And then acknowledging our own journeys, our own privilege, the cushions upon which, you know, we were raised. The toolkit talks about, like, well, as a parent, comma, right? I mean, it's establishing that recognition with audience, but what you're saying, Martha, goes even deeper. It's a kind of laying bare our own sense of self and our own sense of expectations and of assumptions that, as you said, Clint, you know, shroud us every time we walk into any kind of space. Yeah. Wait, let's see how we're doing. Okay, let's see. I think Denise and then Melinda. I think that's Denise. Yes, fabulous. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Denise Maringolo. I'm an associate professor of history, and I'm the director of public history at UMBC. And yay. I love this so much. I feel very gratified because I feel like my teaching has been moving in this direction. So I'm not leaving here thinking, oh my God, I have to redo everything.
So much work to do.
I feel good. But I'm thinking about how this structure is so intimate. And I'm listening to each of you, and I know some of you, and I know that you're committed to this work as individuals, but institutions make it really, really hard. And I'm specifically even thinking about the Smithsonian and how much distance there is between any kind of community as audience and the work you're doing. And so how do you dismantle your institutions in a way to do the kind of work that we want them to do? How do you build a new institution within this structure that's going to work the way that you want it to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, carefully and with courage, right? I don't know if you were able to come see the Emmett Till marker that we were so deeply honored to collect from the community of Tallahatchie, Mississippi, riddled with 317 bullet marks and collected by two remarkable colleagues, Sion Wolde-Michael and Nancy Burkaw, as we're growing a Center for Restorative History, right, and putting it in the center of the museum and Flag Hall for a few months in the middle of a pandemic. That work could only happen after years of work with Tallahatchie community and them believing in us that we would take care of and steward that, not just that object, but all that represented. That's the marker site on the river, the Tallahatchie River, where young Emmett's body was retrieved. So I do think there are ways, I think, that they take everything we know, and we have a sense, I think we have a tendency as historians and practitioners and public intellectuals sometimes to fossilize ourselves even. We're not the same historians in 2022 than when we were trained in the 80s, 90s, whatever we were trained, whatever era. And what a gift that is, right? What a gift it is to grow and learn in community together as historians, but also what a gift it is really to bring forth all of that knowledge of the work we've done in the field, and toiling in the field. So I don't know. Thank you for letting me tell that story. But Jorge, you want to talk about that bit as you approach the newest
Yes.
National Museum of the American Latino?
Someone asked me that.
We can ask Eduardo.
Yeah, I was
too.
asked the same question coming from a community-based museum. What do I do here, and how do I transfer that? But I'm glad I have those experiences working in a community-based museum, and that's the first thing I said during my interview. You know, one of my first tasks is to reach out to every Latino community that I can across the United States to gather those stories and make it a community-based museum. They will build a narrative, right? They will be inclusive. It will be hopefully everyone I can get in touch with to help out with this cause. So it is a group effort in a sense, and I hope that carries through to the final product. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, part of my job at Johns Hopkins is, or my interpretation of my job at Hard Histories,
Which I hope is growing and changing every day. Yeah.
I like that.
you know, is to take on our myths, right, and to dismantle them and replace them, right, with what I would call history. While for now at least our project will leave the brick and mortar to stand, I think there's something extraordinarily powerful in taking on the kinds of stories that we tell about ourselves as institutions, the way we justify and rationalize and promote and glorify ourselves. And the story of Mr. Hopkins, it turns out to be one of many that we tell as an institution, these shorthands that are really more boosterism than anything else. And so for me, that has been maybe that's as close as I ever get to tearing down the institution or taking it on. But I hope that the purpose, right, is to reset the table, right, and to deprive us of continuing to lean on and promote and rationalize what we do through the kind of untruths that are part of those myths.
Well, we're doing the same thing at the Smithsonian, you know, especially under Secretary Bunch's leadership, of really envisioning both what our shared future would look like, and the first big project we're tackling is reckoning with not only our own racial and racist and racialized past, but that of the nation. So it's a remarkable, I think, collective and community undertaking. Yeah. All right, Melinda, you get the last question, my friend. I think we could probably talk all night, but it is 1859.
Good evening. I'm Melinda Machado. I have the privilege of working here with Anthea. My question for the panelists in particular has to do with, you know, we're here with the AASLH, and so I didn't want us to leave this evening without addressing what is happening at the state level with history and race. And so I think, you know, I'm from Texas, a very racist state, always has been. And, you know, Clint talked about, you know, being in Louisiana, New Orleans, and surrounded by this Confederate iconography. Jorge, you've lived in Miami most of your life. You know, so Florida, Louisiana, Texas are states that are rolling back how we can talk about race. And we had, you know, at the beginning, sort of as the pandemic was raging, we also saw these Confederate statues toppling. And now it seems there will be these state and local laws. Teachers are afraid. Sure. I think that's a big reason why this toolkit is going to be very important. How we can use words to make these incredible history positions, you know, you've all stated, so that we can bring in audiences and not alienate those who are stuck in the myths. But I'd like you all to maybe give some encouraging words of what we can do with what is happening in the states, and how we can fight the good fight without getting funding shut down.
There you go. Thank you so
wow.
much, Melinda, for making sure we didn't omit that kind of astounding reemergence with a vengeance and clause and laws and laws and laws proposed of what we're seeing again as the next kind of history wars, if you will, and the gag orders. There's an amazing Google sheet circulating. I'm happy to send it to you if you haven't seen it, just that's tracking state by state all the different gag orders. So it is incredibly real, so thank you for that. So thoughts on that? Yeah.
We've had a strong, strong superintendent for the public schools in Miami-Dade County until recently, so I'm not sure how the new person is going to handle this, but it was very contentious and lawsuits back and forth between the governor and from mass mandates to race, critical race theory. I feel our museum, at least, is providing that, again, a platform, that resource, and asking the teachers, what do you want to learn? What is it you want your kids to learn? So maybe they can't provide that coursework or that education, but we can. And we find ways to provide this critical thinking skills and all the lesson plans and the materials that we send to the schools, and when they come to the museum and in the outreach that we do. So we are providing that resource that maybe they can't be some forthcoming about, right?
Yeah, and there are all kinds of tactics. I think, Trevor, I was talking to you before the program started, and Nebraska, one of the tactics, if you really feel you can't get to a legislator or a person of influence along the lines of the framework, go right to the fact that, hey, did you know that, am I right, Trevor, where 30% of Nebraska teachers are thinking about leaving at the end of the year because of you're making their job so hard.
So
I would guess that
restrictive.
if we survey teachers nationally, it's probably similar. So again, who is going to teach the children of Nebraska, Texas, Louisiana, California, wherever? Maybe I think that's a great tactic, right, to figure out what then will work, what resonates with different individuals who are proposing to clamp down on the very ways in which we teach. Yeah. What do you guys get the last word?
For me, this has been a year. We're still in February, but it's been a long year.
Remember, there are dog years, right?
And my first commitment was to spend as much time as I can with K through 12 educators. Why? Because I think that for me, part of the work right now is to trouble and to blur and to lower some of the barriers and narrow some of the distance. I feel the same way about journalists. I just think this is a time, for all good human beings, right, to be in fellowship in our work and to link arms with one another and to set aside, journalists and historians could go at it all day, and nothing we like better than coming to your museum and telling you, but I think this is not right. This is not the time. It's a different sort of time, and I'm someone who's had my work banned now, suppressed, and all of a sudden I am inside the American Library Association, right? And there they are, right, championing my book, I had no idea, right, that even existed. So I think that for me it's building a different kind of community, very deliberately, the one that will permit us to do our best work and to do our best advocacy, but also I think will help us to, as best we can, weather, I think, what is upon us and what is unfolding. So I want to say how grateful I am for the invitation to be here, because this is, for me, is a small manifestation of that commitment to meet you all, to know you all, to be in conversation, because I think this, for me, is the way to do meaningful work. It will be the only way to do really meaningful work in the months and the years to come. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just briefly, to piggyback off that, I think the best work is done in community, and I think it's done collectively. And I think that if our teachers or our historians or our scholars feel like they are pushing back against state-sanctioned laws and gag orders in isolation, then it feels much more overwhelming, and it feels a much more impossible and isolating and paralyzing task. I think that to the extent that you can find silver linings in the pandemic, there's so many sort of virtual and online communities have blossomed, and people who, teachers in Nebraska have found teachers in Mississippi, who found teachers in Louisiana, who found teachers in Texas, who, whether it's in Facebook groups or through organizations like Facing History and Ourselves or Teaching Tolerance or any of these great organizations out there, have recognized that that there are a lot of people who are asking the same questions as they are and who want the same resources. I mean, I was a high school teacher before I was a full-time writer, and like what teachers want more than anything is like to just be given the resources to do their job well, right? Whether it's in the context of professional development or somebody being like, we made you the syllabus, we made you the lesson plan, we made you the thing, just do this, do that. Because it's hard. I mean, the part of the difficulty of teaching is that like, it's so hard to be innovative and to find ways to improve your pedagogy or to teach things new or to respond to what's happening in a sort of larger political ecosystem when you aren't given the time to do that, right? But I think to the extent that like museums and scholars and journalists and public historians and all these institutions can really provide teachers with as many resources as possible, with as much support as possible, with saying, we are here for you. As Jorge said, like, let us know what you need and we can get it to you. I think teachers, it's interesting because part of it is like, today, I think today is the 10th anniversary of Trayvon Martin's death. There has been over the course of the Black Lives Matter movement, as was the case during the Civil Rights Movement, there's been a profound shift in public consciousness in this country. Again, not linear, often inconsistent, often ebbs and flows, but a shift in which most people recognize now that racism is not just an interpersonal phenomenon, it's a systemic one, it's a structural one, a historical one, a sociological one. And I think that the very reason you're experiencing this state-sanctioned pushback is because you have millions of people who now have a more inclusive, holistic understanding of American history than they previously did. And if you are someone whose sense of self is tied to a story of American history that fewer and fewer people are telling, then you're experiencing this not as like a sort of inconvenient reassessment of history. It's an existential crisis to like who you understand yourself to be. I mean, these are people who feel like their backs are against the wall, that their very sense of who they understand themselves to be is under siege.
Threatened.
And so that is, the stakes feel really high for people. And I think to the extent and that is only going to fuel more intense backlash, I think, in the months and years to come. So I think that's the sort of larger context that we're working with. But it's, again, we saw this in the Civil Rights Movement. We've seen this in any moment where activists and organizers have opened up space for writers and journalists and filmmakers and folks to create work that helps to shift public consciousness. And I think just making sure that we have teachers' backs and that we're supporting them not only in our language and our rhetoric, but also in the sort of material resource interventions that we can provide them with.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you to everyone in the room. Thank you, everyone watching us virtually, to the point about new communities being built. And thank you to John and Beth, Stephanie, who's not able to be with us tonight, and really to all of you. You're here because the teaching, the belief, the practice, the very work of history matters, and we're all deeply grateful. So thank you again. Go forth in community, and go forth in living the life that we know we can to create that more just and compassionate future. So thank you.